In 1833, Nathaniel Wyeth, on his first trip over the Rockies to the west, wrote back to his brother in Boston, saying that the journey was attended with less of the difficulties that we expected and also less romance and adventure. I think that's probably one of the first times that romance and adventure was associated with the fur trade. I think people today are interested more in the romance and adventure than they are with the business aspects of the fur trade. But it was a business after all. And what romance and adventure there was happened in the context of profit and loss, production and accounting, and the sorts of information that told the fur trade entrepreneurs what was happening in their business. So today I'm going to be talking about some business aspects of an incident that was more tragedy than adventure. I'm going to say how I got interested in the topic, where the research led me, and how I discovered something new to say about Jedediah Smith. Next. One more. In 2018, the Hudson Bay Company Archives in Winnipeg released a huge trove of digitized manuscript documents. I'm always looking for new sources, and as I was browsing through the document dump from the Hudson Bay Company Archives, I came across this document. You'll see at the reading from right to left that these are bills on Canada. That means that they're bills of exchange charged to the Canada office that is in Montreal rather than London for outfit 1828, which was Hudson Bay Company's fiscal year that ran from June 1st, 1828 to May 31st, 1829. So reading from right to left, you see that both bills were drawn on Fort Vancouver. The first one on the 29th of December, 1828. The second on the 9th of March, 1829. Both were drawn by Governor Simpson, and they were payable to Smith, Jackson, and Sublette. On the right side, in remarks, you see that both were for furs and horses bought of Jedediah S. Smith. I've taken the amounts in the middle and copied them down below the screen, below the document, to show you what the amounts were. They total 1,091 pounds and 3 shillings. And at the exchange rate of the time, that comes to $4,850. Needless to say, I was intrigued. Now, the story of Jedediah Smith's trip through Oregon and the Umpqua Massacre has been told many times in the fur trade literature. One recent recounting was Jim Auld's article in the 2014 Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, Disaster at Defeat River. But a brief recap will provide some context for the exercise in forensic accounting that'll come later. Smith was traveling up through California, where he sold the furs that he had accumulated at that time and bought 300 head of horses that he intended to sell in the Rocky Mountains. His trip east was blocked first by the Sierra Nevada and then by the Siskiyou Mountains to the north. So he moved toward the coast and came on up, and they made it as far as the Umpqua River, where on July 14th, 1828, a group of Kalawatset Indians entered the camp and murdered 15 of the men there, and one only escaped, Arthur Black. He started north and arrived at Fort Vancouver on August 10th. Jedediah Smith and two other men had been scouting a trail. When they came back and saw what had happened, they couldn't enter the camp, so they headed north on foot and arrived on August 10th. Then from September 6th to December 10th, a recovery expedition was sent by John McLaughlin, the superintendent of Fort Vancouver, to try to recover as much of Smith's property as they could. In the meantime, on October 25th, George Simpson, the governor of the Hudson Bay Company's operation in North America, that is the general manager, arrived at Fort Vancouver on one of his periodic inspection tours. He wintered over at Fort Vancouver, as did Smith, and during that time they negotiated a price for the recovered property. On March 12th, Smith and Arthur Black headed east, hitching a ride on one of the Hudson Bay Company's boats as far as Fort Colville, where they then headed east to meet up with Davy Jackson and eventually with Bill Sublette. Next. Now, there are three elements to what a Hudson Bay Company provided for Smith during this period in Oregon. First was the personal hospitality. That amounts to 8 months of room and board. It's the sort of thing that John McLaughlin provided to any visitor. It's a small amount compared to the other elements, and there's really no way to quantify it. So we'll leave that aside. The recovery of the property is a much more important matter. It occupied 38 men for 3 months. And during that time, they could have spent trapping for Hudson Bay Company. George Simpson estimated that the loss to the company of these men's services was about 1,000 pounds sterling. Well, that might be a pretty good guess, but it's also difficult to quantify this amount. Suffice it to say that there was a considerable amount of free services provided to Smith and a loss to Hudson Bay Company. A much more important item in monetary terms was the purchase of the recovered property. And that can be quantified much more exactly, and that's the focus of this talk. Now, in many of the previous accounts of the Umpqua Massacre, authors have provided a dollar figure for the payment. In 1870, Francis Fuller Victor wrote a biography of Joe Meek, a former mountain man. And based on the lore that he heard from the other mountain men at the time when he was in the Rockies, this is rumor and hearsay, he told Mrs. Victor that the amount of property that Smith had was worth $20,000. So Bancroft in 1884, in the history of the Pacific Northwest, repeated that number. Hiram Chittenden in 1902 turned it into the amount that that Hudson Bay Company had paid for the property. And that was repeated by Harrison Dale in 1918, John Neihart in The Splendid Wayfaring, and the $20,000 figure appears at least as late as 1979 in David Weishart's survey of the Western fur trade. Now, in 1934 and 1936, Maurice Sullivan wrote two important books. The Travels of Jedediah Smith in 1934 and Jedediah Smith, Trail and Trailmaker in 1936. And in those books, Sullivan gave a figure of $2,600 for the amount that was paid for the property. We'll get back to that in due time. But the most diligent effort to try to solve this problem was done by Dale Morgan during his research for Jedediah Smith and the opening of the West published in 1953. Next slide. Now, Dale Morgan was in communication with the archivist at the Hudson Bay Company headquarters in London, where the archives were at that time. He had read a review written by Richard Clark, a professor of history at the University of Oregon, in which Clark mentioned that there were two payments in the amounts that you see on the screen there. And so when Morgan wrote to the archivist in London, he asked him about the two payments and the two numbers. And the archivist wrote back that Professor Clark had the numbers right, but he failed to note that they were in Halifax currency. Then the archivist gave Morgan the method for determining Halifax currency. I won't read it to you there on the screen, but you'll see that it's probably confused Morgan as much as it did me when I read it, and as much as it would confuse everyone else when they saw it today. Next slide. So Morgan had a quandary. He didn't publish an account of the amount the furs were worth, but he must have tried to do that because he then looked at the numbers that were given and said that he couldn't figure out how there was enough property turned over by Jedediah and the stated terms to call for two such payments. He also left this intriguing note that the Hudson Bay Company had found indications that the first draft was canceled. So, what did he do with this information? He decided that the second draft was probably the total payment. And so he wrote that Smith accepted Simpson's offer of £541 6 pence Halifax, and that was the entire payment. Next. When the archivist in London was looking at the document and telling then Morgan about the Halifax currency and that the first payment was possibly canceled, he was looking at the same document that I had looked at in the fuzzy black and white copy of a microfilm image of the document. So this is what he was looking at. And on this much clearer, focused, full color version of the document, you see that Halifax currency is there clearly. And over the amount of the first payment, as you see amplified, magnified on the bottom, the word canceled is clearly but thinly written in red ink. Next. So I'll deal with the matter of Halifax in a minute, but let's get to the canceled question. I don't think the first draft was canceled in favor of the second draft. In other words, the second draft did not cancel out the first draft for several reasons. First, we have clear contrary evidence. In the letter that Simpson wrote to the Montreal office, informing them of the second draft, he clearly wrote that it was for the balance of account of furs and horses sold to the Hudson Bay Company. He did not say that this second draft cancels out the first draft. The second reason is logic. It just doesn't make any sense that the second draft would replace the first draft, since it was much less than Simpson's offer and even less than the first draft. There's no reason why Jedediah Smith should have accepted a second draft that was less than the first. And there's a clear alternative explanation. The first draft was probably canceled when it was turned in to the Montreal office for payment. the way a check is canceled when it's presented at a bank today and paid by the bank. That's for those of us who can remember paper checks. Next. Now, what about Halifax currency? In the period before this, for about 3 centuries, the Spanish peso, which is the piece of 8 of pirate lore, which was always called the dollar in English, had been the most widely circulated currency in international trade, especially in the Western Hemisphere. This dollar was the currency that other currencies were measured against. I should also point out that this was done long before the 13 seaboard colonies joined together to throw off the yoke of British domination, and in 1792 adopted the existing dollar as their currency and gave it 100 cents to replace the 8 bits or the pieces of the Spanish dollar. Now, in 1750, the British established a colony in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the merchants there did most of their business with Spanish America, the West Indies, and the other seaboard colonies, where the dollar was the main currency in circulation. And you can see from the top draft that the sterling exchange rate with the dollar, which had been set by an act of Parliament in 1707 at $4.44 for £1, or 4 shillings and 6 to the dollar, created a very difficult amount to calculate exchanges back and forth. It was awkward and clumsy and error prone. So the merchants in Halifax began to exchange the dollar at 5 shillings even, and that made £1 Halifax and even 4 shillings, $4 rather. And this Halifax exchange rate was widely used in Canada and in the American colonies to the south, and it was logical then that the two drafts would have been issued in Halifax currency. Thanks. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let's do a little forensic accounting. Since 1931, when Frederick Merck published the transcriptions of the correspondence that Simpson wrote to Smith in 1828 in 2 letters in December of that year, he provided, Merck's book was The Fur Trade and Empire. He provided the prices that Simpson offered for the furs. So you see in the middle column here. Simpson also gave the number that had been recovered by the recovery party that you see in the first number column. Those numbers did not include a number for sea otter. But then in 1934, when Maurice Sullivan published The Travels of Jedediah Smith, he included a complete transcription of the journal that McLeod kept on the recovery expedition. And by careful reading of that journal, it's possible to check Simpson's numbers, which look suspiciously round, 750. So it turns out that those numbers match with the numbers that come from McLeod's journal. The journal also shows that there were exactly 4 sea otter pelts recovered as well. So if you multiply the number of pelts and animals and horses by the price for each, you get the total that Simpson offered for the furs on the right column there. Now, you may recall that Maurice Sullivan said that there were about $2,600 paid. Now we know where Sullivan got that number. He didn't know anything about the two drafts, but he did make apparently a calculation like this and came up with his estimate of the amount paid. Next. Now let's compare the payments that Smith made to Simpson's offer. That's shown here in the bottom table in Halifax currency on the right, which the bills were written in, and the equivalent amount in dollars in the middle column. And looking over these numbers, eventually one set of numbers leaped off my electronic spreadsheet and sort of hit me in the face. I've circled them with red boxes and connected them with a line. You see that the first draft, which was issued on the very same day that Simpson wrote a letter to Smith making his offer, is almost exactly the same amount as was offered for the beaver and land otter pelts. Now that suggests very strongly that the first draft was intended to pay for the beaver and land otter and leaving the other furs and horses, the sea otter and horses, and other matters left to further negotiation. Next slide. Now let's look at what happens when you convert Halifax currency into the sterling equivalent, which was conveniently supplied by the HBC archivist to Morgan in 1953. The sterling equivalents are shown on the right column, added now at the bottom. So if you look at the third line there, the total payment across there, and then the fourth line, we enter in Simpson's offer in dollars, Halifax and sterling, and subtract the payment, subtract the offer from the payment, we get the remainder on the proverbial bottom line here. In dollars in Halifax, that remainder, which is what Dale Morgan had a hard time figuring out what to do with, appears in the sterling column as exactly 400 pounds. The 6 pence is probably a residual resulting from rounding errors due to conversion through 3 different currencies and various calculations. So, from this exercise, I concluded that it's very likely that in addition to supplying Smith with hospitality for 8 months, the services of the recovery expedition, and purchase of the furs at generous prices, Simpson added a bonus payment of 400 pounds sterling. Next slide. Now, it might be easier to see this if we put it in a bar graph like this. And it shows the first draft then paying for the beaver and land otter almost exactly. And then the second draft issued on March 9th, paying for the sea otter, the horses, and a considerable bonus payment on the end. That bonus makes up 41% of the total payment. Next slide. So, what did Simpson get in return for this generous treatment? Apparently, he got an agreement not to compete with the Hudson Bay Company in Oregon. In other words, a non-competition agreement. I say apparently because I haven't found any document that explicitly says that, and I don't expect to find one. I think that George Simpson disguised the bonus payment as part of the payment for the furs and horses because he didn't want the word to get out that he had paid the company of Smith, Jackson, and Sublette an extra bonus payment just to stay out of Oregon, because that could have provided the incentive, if the word got out, for other opposition to come into Oregon and declare that they were here and asked to be paid just to leave again. Now, there are several hints in the literature that there was a non-competition agreement, but most of the many references in writing about this incident come from the statement that was made by Joe Meek to his biographer, Francis Feller Victor, published in River in the West in 1870. And what it says here is, that you can read it for yourself, that the partners, when they met back in the Rockies, decided that they would not compete. Joe Meek, who made this statement, had come out to the Rockies for the first time on this trip at age 19, and he had been recruited by Sublette to do it. And on the way out, Sublette had let the crew know that he intended to go head-to-head with Hudson Bay Company in Oregon. So when he got there and had this conference with Smith, having recently returned, apparently he reluctantly consented to this proposition. Next slide. That's it for that, and I thank you very much for your attention.